Okay, thank you. How many of you have ever been in or are in a long-term romantic committed relationship? Okay. How many of you have ever been so mad at your partner for just a split second that you could spit nails? Okay. Anyone here believe that they never have conflict in their relationship? Read the fine print. So one of the things I do, my wife and I are both psychologists in Minneapolis, and I have a practice here in Reno, so I go back and forth every 10 days. So I'm here 10 days, there 10 days. I've got a men's group in Minneapolis that's been going for 30 years, and one here in Reno that's been going for 10 years. And I do intensive couples work, which means working with a couple anywhere from 2 to 6 hours at a time. And people hear that and they go, "You're kidding," and "Oh my God, I can't possibly do that. I'll be exhausted." And at the end of 6 hours, they look at the clock and usually say, "Where did the time go?" So the approach I take is called an ecological systemic approach, which means that the context is everything. So if somebody is clinically depressed and they're in a family that's pretty stable and there are no other major problems, that's very different than somebody who's depressed, who has a spouse who's alcoholic, and kids who are in jail. So context of a system is important. And everything in the universe has rules to it, and they are all systems. And so conflict in relationships is a normal part of everyday life. And the things that people don't realize is that without conflict in a relationship, you wouldn't have a relationship. There wouldn't be one. So people that believe that you can have a great relationship and have no conflict don't have a relationship. So what's the conflict? Thermostat up, thermostat down. That's a conflict. Anybody have that conflict? Okay, in my household, it's I'm messy and leave piles of papers and books all over, and Linda's really neat, and sometimes she goes right through the roof and takes it all and piles it in the office. Well, actually, we did that for 18 years, back and forth, and then finally I agreed to keep it all in the office, and now it works pretty well, most of the time. What I'm going to talk about today is power, grace, integrity, and it really should be evolutionary survival, because to survive on this planet, we as Homo sapiens have to learn how to get along with each other, otherwise it isn't going to work. And power is something that everybody has, control is something that everybody has, and hopefully we can combine power and grace to have control over our lives, but also care about the people that we're with. And I don't know how many of you remember Elizabeth Kubler-Ross or her work on death and dying. Anybody remember her? She's the psychiatrist back in the 1960s who was at the University of Chicago Medical School, and she decided, since nobody was talking about death or dying and that people were declared terminally ill, nobody told their families and nobody told them. They just let them go on and not go through the process of grief. And so one day she decided to get a grant and do a study on the terminally ill. And she got a crew together, and they all started training, and they started working with the patients who were terminally ill. And she was very proud of herself, and they all wore their white lab coats and were very professional, and all had their medical degrees and PhDs. And there was one woman down the hall that would never talk about anything with them. She was completely shut down. And one day, Kubler-Ross was walking by her room, and she heard the woman opening up and talking about all kinds of things, about her children and about what she felt about dying, and she heard the woman cry a little bit. And so Kubler-Ross went into the room, and there was a black woman who was a janitor sitting on the edge of the bed talking to the patient. And Kubler-Ross was irate, and she said, "Get out of this room, you're not allowed in here, go, go, go." Now I heard this at a live talk that she gave at the Mayo Clinic back in the early 70s, and there were probably 250 people in a room that was big enough for 175, and they were all doctors and psychologists. You could have heard a pin drop. It was amazing. So she shooed the woman out. 3 days later, the woman who's in the hospital bed, who still won't talk to them, she overhears her talking again. So she goes in the room, and there's the same woman, the same janitor, sitting on the edge of the bed. And the woman got scared and started to get up and rush out of the room because she thought she was going to be criticized again. And Kubler-Ross had the emotional intelligence to say, stay here, keep talking to her, and when you're done, I want to talk to you about how you're getting her to talk. So that was the turning point in her work with the terminally ill, was to set aside her professional arrogance and start treating her patients like human beings. And when she talked with the woman, she said, how are you getting this patient to talk about her terminal illness? And very matter-of-factly, she turned to Kubler-Ross and said, well, I know a lot about death. My 3-year-old daughter died in my arms in the emergency room in this hospital while I was waiting for medical care. And then you could really have heard a pin drop. The thing about working with human beings in my job is that, and it's such an honor, is that every single one of us on this planet has a story. Every single one of us has wounds. Every single one of us has more strengths than limitations. I grew up in what we call a garden variety Irish alcoholic family in Marin County, California. And my wife Linda grew up in what I call a stealth Swedish alcoholic family in Minneapolis. Both middle-class families, both high-functioning, and underneath it, a lot of pain. Those of you who have grown up in an alcoholic family know that. So, those stages of coming to terms with death are also the stages we all come to terms with anytime we face a disappointment or a loss. So, catching snakes and lizards in Marin County, we're doing a nature study now. Fooled you. When I was a little kid in 1st and 2nd grade, my little pal and I used to hike the coastal mountains above, along the Marin County coast. And we caught snakes and lizards. And we had terrarias in our bedrooms, and we had all these snakes and lizards in them. And we each had a dog, and we had a cat, and the funny thing is, when I went off to school, the snakes and lizards just sat there. And when I got home from school, they just sat there. But the dog got distressed when I went to school, and the dog got really excited when I got home. Because the dog has a limbic system, because the dog is a mammal. And human beings are mammals. Anybody with a limbic system in the brain, which is where all your feelings are, we're mammals. And so people with a limbic system require connecting up with other creatures with a limbic system. There have been several studies recently reported in popular magazines where if you take a dog owner who loves his dog, Linda and I are very neurotic dog owners. We love our dog more than our kids and our grandchildren. And they resent us for it. And when we look into Buddy's eyes, and Buddy looks into our eyes, what happens if we're hooked up and getting blood samples is his oxytocin levels start to go up, and our oxytocin levels start to go up. Now, we've known this intuitively for years. That's why they let dogs go into hospitals and nursing homes and places where people need reassurance and they need their blood pressure to go down and so on, because being around a dog calms us down, because oxytocin is the chemical. It's called the cuddle chemical. It's the chemical that allows us to attach and bond to one another. So there's something physiologically going on between mammals that is very powerful and very important and very necessary. And when we're doing harm to each other, that whole system shuts off, because then we're operating out of terror and we're usually dissociated. A human being can't do damage to another human being unless we're in a dissociated or zoned out state. So, another nature study. Northwestern Ireland, this island off of the Donegal coast, Donegal's where the Friels are from, by the way, and this dolphin, who they thought was male but is actually female, followed the dead body of her mate into the harbor. And she was swimming around, clearly in distress and panicking around the body of her mate. This yellow Labrador retriever, whose name is Ben, went running out onto the concrete jetty and jumped into the harbor and started swimming with her for 3 or 4 hours till he was exhausted. Every day, until a couple of years ago, because I've been using this in lectures for 7 or 8 years, every day, until a few years ago, she would come into the harbor from the open ocean. He would spot her or hear her somehow, because he was the hotel dog. He'd race down the jetty out into the harbor and go out and meet her and swim for up to 3 or 4 hours at a time. Sometimes he'd get so exhausted, and she would sense his exhaustion, and she would come up under him and give him a piggyback ride closer to shore. Now, if dolphins and yellow Labrador retrievers and humans and dogs can do that, human beings can do it too, but it's a much bigger risk for us. The reason we've been running therapy groups for so long is being in a therapy group is a terrifying thing in the beginning because we fear we're going to be exposed and embarrassed and that people will think less of us. And what happens the first time somebody opens up in a group and shares something painful or sad or hurtful that happened to them, and they have their feelings, especially in a guys group, right? Guys don't cry very often. There isn't a dry eye in the house. And what's happening limbically is that everybody's limbic systems are all linking up. And that's what heals all kinds of physical and emotional wounds. The immune system of the body works much better when you're having that kind of limbic connection. So I'm not going to go through the whole list. These are the feelings that are in the limbic system. And these are, by the way, going on all the time, 24/7, especially if you don't think they are. So these are going on all the time. The question is, I wonder if I'm feeling these, and I wonder which ones I'm feeling. And by the way, every one of those feelings is a positive emotion, even though they look like they're uncomfortable. Now, that's an example of the limbic system in action during Take Your Child to Work Day. This has been going around the internet for a long time, but it's still pretty fun. And what do you suppose the emotion is that the little boy is feeling? Terror. And maybe betrayal. How could my dad do this to me? Power control struggles usually come around threat. So when Linda takes my can of Diet Coke off the center island in the kitchen and puts it in the refrigerator, 5 seconds after I went into the garage to get a screwdriver, and I come back, I feel this bit of anger coming up, like somebody's messing with my environment again and moving my stuff. And I know who it is. It's the neat one in the house. So then we have a conflict. And then sometimes the conflict has to heat up because you can't get through conflict always by doing it quietly. So I'll say, did you move my can of pop? Well, you left it out there all day long on the counter yesterday, so I'm sick and tired of watching it, so yeah, I put it in the refrigerator. And then I point at it and I go, okay, don't touch that. I'm going to drink it, I promise. And then the fight's over, right? But what if it's bigger? What if it's something scary or threatening? Then the fight gets big, and then what people have to learn how to do is, how do you act from the better part of yourself when things are really revving up and getting scary? So power without graciousness is being a bully or a perpetrator. Graciousness without being powerful is being a victim. And when you combine power and grace, then you've really got a competent, grown-up, differentiated adult. You know about bonobos and chimps? They're cousins, they look very much alike. If a chimp strays into another chimp's territory, they will immediately tear him to shreds and kill him. It's not very hospitable. Good neighbors. If a bonobo strays into another bonobo's territory, they immediately go up and offer him food. So it's two very different genetic or socially evolved strategies for dealing with conflict. So you know you're becoming a competent adult when you can choose the pain of loneliness, hurt, shame, and fear rather than hurt yourself, hurt others, or let others hurt you. And that is the challenge that I and Linda offer to all of our clients, whether it's individual, couple, or men's group, is can you act for the best part of yourself even when your partner is not? And can you do that more and more often as you grow? Because it's a very hard thing to do. And that's something that's a lifelong challenge. Lastly, you may remember Robert Kennedy's speech the night that Martin Luther King was assassinated. He got off the campaign plane after flying for just a few minutes. Got off the plane, was told that Martin Luther King had actually died, and he was in Indianapolis, and he was scheduled to walk into the middle of an African-American ghetto crowd, a large crowd, because he was campaigning for president. The police, his staff, they all said, don't do it. Pretty much off the cuff, he walked out, got in the back of a flatbed truck, and gave what's considered to be one of the 100 greatest speeches in all history without preparation. And what he said was, I have some very sad news for all of us in the United States and for all of us who love Dr. Martin Luther King and for all of us who love peace and justice. Martin Luther King has been shot and killed tonight. And the crowd went wild, angry. He continued to talk. He said, for those of you who are angry at all white people and are bitter and want to get revenge, I understand that. And then for the first time, he publicly acknowledged the assassination of his brother, President Kennedy. And he said, I know because I had a family member who was killed by a white man also. And the crowd got real quiet. And then he went on and talked about being true to Martin Luther King's principles and love and justice. And then, off the top of his head, he said, my favorite poet is Aeschylus. And he cited that poem. Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. And they could have heard a pin drop. They all got it. And they asked people to go home and pray for the family of Martin Luther King and for our country, and they ended it with, let's try to do what the Greeks said long ago, which is to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Riots broke out in over 60 cities in the U.S., not in Indianapolis. That's the power of being powerful and graceful and gracious and having courage and integrity. And that will ensure our evolutionary survival, because the research shows that animals that take care of their sick and their elderly and their weak are much more likely to preserve their gene pool and their genes in the gene pool than those that dispense with their sick and their elderly and their weak. And so the last thing, I know I'm over 1 minute, from August Wilson, I've used this for years in trainings. There are always and only two trains running. There is life and there is death. Each of us rides them both. To live life with dignity, to celebrate and accept responsibility for your presence in the world is all that can be asked of anyone. Thank you.